and opportunity for us all to be here and be safe. We will open your word. And I just thank you for everyone who's made it a commitment to be willing to put their lives together. And I pray that our hearts will learn and grow.
How many weeks in a row has that happened, Greg? Probably not.
Pretty much every week in a row.
Only every week? That's all. Usually not more than 3 times. All right, so we're going through the life of Moses, so we're still in the book of Exodus. Moses is one of those people and one of those individuals in God's Word that we know quite a few things about just from our general Bible knowledge. So if you were going to talk about or try to name one of the 5 main events in Moses' life that probably most people have heard of, somebody name one.
Nile River.
Okay,
Basket.
The basket, being a baby in the Nile. Okay, put the basket. What's another one?
Plagues. So burning bush.
10 plagues.
Not in order.
Burning bush. Okay. So we got 3. What would be a couple more that stand out? Parting of the Red Sea. Okay.
Killing someone and then having to flee.
Okay, so that's probably a lesser known one, but that's a pretty well known one.
Ten
Yeah.
Commandments.
10 Commandments is probably more so known than that. Those are the 5 that jumped out at me immediately. There's a lot of other accounts in Moses' life that we're familiar with. We're going to be talking about one of those tonight, and so I want to give you a warning that I've given you before when we hit a familiar passage, something that if you've grown up in Sunday school, grown up in the church, you've heard this story probably most every year of Moses parting the Red Sea and the Israelites walking through, and the Egyptian army dying in the Red Sea. Spoiler alert, that's the whole story. And they're free to go, free from the Egyptian army. Probably not really a spoiler for anyone because it's a very familiar account. But this passage that we're going to look at tonight, along with let's put it in a bigger context, along with a lot of the passages that relate to the week that we're in the church calendar. The crucifixion of Jesus. Jesus' triumphal entry, his crucifixion, his trial, his death, his burial, his resurrection. Those are so familiar because we go over them every year. We go over them every year. It's like all the time. It's like, okay, I know this one. And so what do? It's easy to check out. It's really easy to just, I know this already. Is that the dog or you? I know this already. I'm not going to listen anymore. And because I've already heard this. So I want to give you this warning because here's the truth that you need to apply, maybe especially, but definitely apply to the familiar or almost overly familiar passages. The Word of God is alive and powerful. God wants to work through this Word, through these truths tonight, the same way He would if this was the first time. If that whole account I just gave of Moses parting the Red Sea and the Israelites walking through on dry land, if that was like, what? If you're like, I've never heard that. That's awesome.
I already came across a story that I had never heard in the Bible, and it shocked me.
But this one is familiar to you, right, Fred?
Yeah.
Okay, you've heard this one before. So
you should teach them about the ghost of Samuel. That shocked me. That terrified me.
We're not there. So when you're sitting up here, you can tell us where we're going. Okay, so tonight will be in Exodus 14. But don't tune out. Don't check out. Don't say, oh, I know what happens next. Oh, I know what happens next. Let God speak to you through His Word, because I've read this account dozens and dozens and dozens of times. I don't know, hundreds of times maybe. And even going through studying it, I'm like, huh, that's it. I didn't realize that, and that fit with that, or how that related. God's word truly is living and powerful. So tonight we're going to look at the crossing of the Red Sea, and we're going to see Egypt is finally delivered, or Israel is finally delivered from Egypt's tyranny. Is what we're going to look at tonight. So we're going to start at the end of chapter 17 or 13 and work our way through chapter 14. So first thing we're going to see is how God was leading them. He'd worked through the 10 plagues, as we typically call them, and so we're going to look at God's leading, and we're going to see three different things. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of skim through the first part of this and camp out on the last part of this account. So God's leading there. There were a couple specific things. If you look at these verses here, and we're not going to go through and read them all for time's sake tonight, because we're covering a chapter and a half or so tonight. But God specifically said, I'm not going to lead you the short route to the land of Canaan. That would be through the land of the Philistines. And you're not ready for that war of that magnitude. That's not a place that this nation is at. And so I'm not leading you that way. And so there was a quick route to the promised land. They didn't take that. They definitely didn't take that. They took the 40-year route. Okay? But if they had not sinned, it would have been about a 1-year journey, the way they went and the time they took and everything like that, if they had not refused to go in when God told them to go in the first time. But they ended up taking about 40 years. But God specifically did not lead them on the short route. He did not take them the quick way. Because they weren't ready for war of that magnitude. The Philistines were a brutal army, as were the Egyptians, but they were not ready. And God said, I don't want you to go into that battle that way. But the other thing is God had an agenda for them, the opposite direction. Okay, so they're in Egypt. The land of the Philistines is up here. The promised land is up here. Okay, so you can take that shortcut and go that way. But God had an appointment for them down here at Mount Sinai. God had some events and some things he wanted to do through that mountain where he initially met with Moses. And that's when he will give them the 10 Commandments. And so he wants to lead them that way specifically. And so that's in the opposite direction. So God didn't lead them that way for a couple reasons. But God is definitely leading them and directing them where to go. Not only where to go, but where not to go. Second thing we see is in this the end of chapter 13, he talks about how he leads them. And from this point on, God gives them a visible sign of his presence and a visible sign of how he's leading them. And that is a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. So the instructions for the Israelites were pretty simple. God's leading us, and when the cloud moves, we move. And when the cloud stops, we stop. And when the pillar of fire turns right, we turn right. And that's pretty much how we're going to follow God. That's pretty much how we're going to know where God is leading us. This wasn't just a natural phenomenon God sent. Most theologians, or a lot of theologians, believe that it was the actual presence of God was represented by that pillar of cloud and pillar of fire. And the Bible tells us that pillar wasn't removed until they entered the promised land. So they had that guidance for all those years. God had promised Moses, I will be with you. Was with them. The title that we've given this whole series is The Promise of God's Presence. And here's a symbol of that promise, that pillar of cloud, that pillar of fire. And then the other way we see God leading them is he told them where to set up camp. He told them where to set up camp. I want you to come to the sea and stop there. And if you're going on a camping trip, you're like, yeah, by the water, that's a great place to set up. Nice breeze coming in. Lovely view, all that kind of stuff. God told them to go set up by the sea. From Pharaoh's perspective, it tells us in these verses that they're wandering aimlessly. These losers don't know where they're going. Okay, they say their land is up here and they're going down here. They're never going to get there. They're taking the really long way, going around the world that way. Okay, live in another world. Okay, but or was it round?
To be fair, from where we are standing, it would appear to be flat.
So, and then they stop. And the place they stop, Pharaoh's looking at him and he's like, how stupid can they be? They back themselves into a corner. There's no way out. There's a sea to one side of them, and we're going to chase them down, and we're on the other side. They have no out. They don't. They need a new directional, a new navigator for their team, and they need someone who has a little bit of a brain in leaving themselves an out. But this is all part of God's direction. God sent them specifically there with their backs to the sea with no way out, appearing to wander aimlessly, but it was exactly what God had told them to do. So what happens next? Pharaoh starts to chase them. Pharaoh's pursuit is verses 4 through 12 of chapter 4. So Pharaoh drives them out of Egypt after the 10th plague, after the firstborn and all the land dies. He drives them out of Egypt, but he has a change of heart. It tells us his heart hardened even more. It tells us that after every plague and before all plagues, how hard could this guy's heart really be by this time? He is so stubborn, so set on defying God.
It's a represent. What I think you should notice here is that if Pharaoh's heart is this hard, imagine how hard Satan's heart is.
Good point. So it tells us that Pharaoh was told they left. Now you read that and you're like, that's kind of weird. I thought he already knew they left because he told them to leave. It could have been one of two things. It could have been he may have anticipated, y'all get out of here, and there's so many of them, it's going to take them a while to do this. He didn't realize that they ate dinner that night with their shoes on, with their staff in hand, and their bags packed, ready to walk out the door at a moment's notice. They were ready, and they were hitting the trail before Pharaoh even fully figured out what has happened. Wait, my oldest has died? Wait, your oldest has died? Wait, every household, the oldest has died? Before he even figured that out, they're already on the way. So he may not have anticipated how quickly they would leave, but he also may not have anticipated that the realization may have hit him, wait, they're not coming back. They're not coming back. We had hundreds of thousands of free laborers to do all of our work. Now they're gone. They're not coming back. We need to go back. We need that free labor here. So Pharaoh has this huge show of force. Yes, sir.
You can relate it to, like, you ever hear about that relationship? Somebody tells the other person, oh, you can go ahead and leave, and they leave, come back. It's like, wait, actually left this time.
It's like joke.
They knew they were leaving,
but then
they actually left. It's like, well, I didn't think that.
Wait, I didn't think that would really happen, or I didn't realize that how I would really respond if that happened, or whatever. Yeah, exactly. So Pharaoh had this change of heart, and then he decides he's determined to go get it. Okay, and he calls out his best officers, the best of his military. Bring them back. I want them back here. We're bringing them back. Think about this in comparison to what we've read over the last couple of weeks. Why would you want those people back in your land? after your land is devastated.
He's not very bright.
Your land is completely devastated, and that's where the hard heart kicks in. It's not that he's not so bright, because he's probably a highly intelligent person, but his hard heart overrules the reason of his brain. The reasoning just is not kicking in. So he sends 600 of his best chariot teams. The chariots of that day were the most sophisticated war tool of war, weapon of war that there was. They were a game changer. If a nation had an army of chariots, they were untouchable, essentially, because it just changed the whole game. Because someone riding in a chariot could move so much faster and be so much more defended than someone standing out in the open.
Chariots are actually what defeated Egypt's Middle Kingdom. The introduction of chariots by the Hyksos from the Middle East, Egyptians didn't have those. Then the Middle Kingdom of Egypt fell, and then when the New Kingdom arose, which is implied to be, because they had chariots, they became the most powerful empire in the world at the time.
So we have the best, and a little extra history here. And we have the best. We have the best army in the world, one of the world powerhouses of the day, with the best weaponry, and they're chasing. So he's bringing out this huge show of forces. Send every chariot I have. Send all my officers. I want every military mind. I want every weapon we have. Go after them and bring them back. And then we see that he traps Israel. It's probably not too hard to track 2 million people and all their flocks and herds wandering through a desert area kind of thing. Probably not too hard to figure out where they've gone and where they land. A camp of 2 million people is probably somewhat noticeable. So they found them pretty quickly, and they have them pinned. There's no way out. The most sophisticated army in the world, the best weaponry, against this group of slaves who knows nothing about warfare. So he chased them down, he trapped them with their backs to the Red Sea, and his intimidation tactics worked because Israel was terrified. Look with me at chapter 14, verse 10. It says, as Pharaoh drew near, so they're bringing, the chariots are coming, this dust is rising because all these chariots are charging. You can hear the hooves of the horses from far away that rumble in the chariot wheels. And as Pharaoh is drawing near, the sons of Israel looked, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they became very frightened. So the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord. So first they cried out to the Lord. Good, right? That's a good plan. Turn to God. Then they turned to Moses and said, is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness?
Excuse me.
And so this is the first of many conversations Moses and the people of Israel will have along this line. Why have you dealt with us? Look at the finger pointing at Moses. Why have you, Moses, sticking their pointing finger in his chest, why have you dealt with us this way? You're dealing with us this way. My family, you're dealing with me this way. Why are you treating me like this? Bringing us out of Egypt. Is this not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? So what is it they want now? What are they asking for? What are they begging for?
Salvation from the Egyptians?
They're asking for salvation from Moses. We want to go back to Egypt. We want to go back to slavery. We want to go back because it was comfortable. It was safe. We knew how things worked there. Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians, for it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. So, how is God's presence made known? And how is he guiding and directing them at this point? Anybody remember? What's the visible presence of God? Pillar of cloud by day, pillar of fire by night. Okay?
I think, regarding the parting of the Red Sea, I think this is a very good example of what Jesus had to deal with later. For a short time, they would follow Moses because he did something miraculous, but eventually they get bored, they want something new, and they lose faith. This is what happened with Jesus.
I think what we're seeing there is, we see that in the Israelites. You're saying we see that in the Jews of Jesus' day.
Exactly.
We see that in our lives, if we look closely enough.
You see something miraculous, but then eventually
you get numb to it, and you move on, and you get whiny, and you complain again. And I think there's a lot of lessons here for us if we're honest. So they're saying all this. They're accusing Moses. They're like, "Why have you done this to us, Moses?" And the whole time they are in view of the pillar of cloud or the pillar of fire. They're in view of the presence of God, the God who has delivered them through the plagues and preserved them through the Passover, preserved the oldest of every family for the Israelites, and delivered them with the wealth of the Egyptians. And they're saying that while God is present. They forgot. They forgot a lot of things. They forgot the oppression that they faced. They forgot the whining and the crying out to God that they did because it was so difficult. They forgot the power of God as it was demonstrated through all the plagues. The plagues that were only present in Egypt and didn't affect the Israelites. They forgot the power of God. They forgot the promise of God. God had told them hundreds of years, 500 years earlier through Abraham, then through Isaac, then through Jacob, then through Joseph, and through their whole history there in Egypt. God has a promised land that He's going to bring us out to, and He will bring us there, and we will only be in this land 400 years as slaves, and then we will be brought out, and that time is now. They forgot the promise of God, and they said, "We want to go back." Egypt. Pharaoh's intimidation worked on them. Pharaoh's intimidation got their eyes off of God and got their eyes on the circumstances around them. And we'll see how that is dealt with. So this last section I want to just take just a little more time on. So the last section is that it just shows us how God defeats Egypt. How God defeats Egypt. And the first thing we're going to see is Moses' faith. So look with me at chapter 14, verse 13. But Moses said to the people, okay, so they're poking their finger in his chest. They're accusing him. They're saying, "We want to go back to Egypt." They're saying that you brought us out here because you don't even care about us. All these accusations to Moses. And Moses says to the people, "Do not fear. Stand by and see the salvation of the Lord, which He will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you have seen today, you will never see them again." Moses doesn't go back and forth with them, doesn't get into this debate and this argument. He turns their eyes where they need to be. Stop looking at Pharaoh. Stop looking at the chariots. So he tells them three things. He gave them three instructions in how they should respond to God. Do not fear. Stand and see. You see all those in verse 13 there? Do not fear. Stand by. See salvation of God. So he says, do not fear. That means take courage is what that means. And we see that same phrase used that God uses in speaking to Joshua multiple times as they're entering the promised land about 40 years after these events. Take courage. Do not fear. When we fear, we're looking at our circumstances rather than God. We're looking at human perspective rather than godly perspective. Moses tells them, do not fear, but he doesn't say that because of their military strength. He doesn't say that because they have the upper hand on Pharaoh. There's this. We have We're in a great situation, guys. So don't fear. Just watch. Watch. They can't get to us from where they are. They think they can, but they can't. No, they were in a horrible situation. From a military perspective, they were. Do I say dead in the water? Is that wrong in this case? But they had no way out. He didn't tell them, "Do not fear," because Egypt is weak. They can't do anything to you. No, this is the Navy SEALs of the Egyptian army, the world's best, most powerful fighters, are approaching you with ill intent.
It's like saying, "Hey guys, let's take on SEAL Team 6. I think it'll be fun."
Yeah, and so he's saying, "Do not fear, because we can trust in God. Do not fear, because here's what you got to remember, guys. God led us here. He didn't lead us by the way of the Philistines. He led us here. He knew exactly where he wanted to bring us. And we're sitting right here. See the cloud? See the pillar of fire? That's because we're in the presence of God. We're exactly where he wants us to be. So don't fear." Second thing he tells them is stand. Stand. Don't back down. Don't retreat. Don't try to fix it yourself. Have y'all ever do that? Get into a situation rather than trust God. That's like sixth on your list of things to do. First is fix it myself. Like don't try to fix this yourself. I used to do home improvement stuff for many years, and it was a lot of fun. But there were some very aggravating jobs because you would go into someone's house and they had already tried to do it themselves. And we always had a joke. It's it'll cost you, to do this job, it'll cost you $50. If you already tried to fix it yourself, it'll cost you $100. Okay, so because we have to undo what you've done and fix all the things that you messed up, and then we have to fix it the right way. And so you've about tripled our work by trying to fix it yourself. Don't try to fix it yourself. He tells them stand. Stand by is actually what he says in this verse. And don't be frantic. Don't panic. Don't get don't go into this spiral. Stand. Stand in confidence. Put your confidence in God. Have you ever been in a position, a situation where there's nothing you can do to fix it? There's nothing you can do to make it better. There's nothing you can do to make it go away. It just is. It's a hard place. That's where they are. There's no way out. In that moment, put your confidence in God. Because at this moment, Israel's backed into a corner, and that army is closing in on them every moment. They're coming in full force. And Moses says, 2 things. Don't be afraid. Stand. Be courageous. Stand firm. Last thing he says,
God is bigger than Pharaoh.
God is bigger than Pharaoh, and you're going to see. Essentially, he's saying, pay attention. Nothing's happened yet. So he's not saying, see, look, it's already here. No, he's saying, see, pay attention. I want you to have your eyes open for what's about to happen. God's about to do something big. God's about to do something. So turn your attention away from your circumstances, because if you keep your eyes on the chariots, you're going to miss what God's going to do. He says, I want you to see. Let me read it here. See the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. Something's going to happen today. Moses wants them to realize This is a God thing that's about to happen. Sometimes we kind of chalk it up as like, well, I was in a tough spot and wasn't that fortunate that happened. That worked out pretty well for me. I guess I must be a pretty good person. There have been points in our life where we've been in a financial position, and I've told this account before, but somehow someone wanted to help us out with a bill, with the financial situation that we were in. It was like there's nothing we can do about this. We're over our heads. This is impossible. And someone wanted to help us, so they mailed us an anonymous letter to our family at our address. They had the street. What was wrong on it? The street address and the zip code were wrong. There was no return address on it. Jehovah Jireh was written on it, which means God our provider. That was the return address, so the post office isn't really going to do much with that and say, "Oops." But inside was it was a cash gift. Was it like $500 worth? Five $100 bills, I think it was. God's like, you know what? I want the Waltons to have that money because they have a need. And so, in spite of the wrong address, in spite of the wrong zip code, in spite of there's no return address, even if this were to get lost, God got it to our mailbox. Because don't chalk that up to, man, we had a lucky day. That was a total God thing. And that's what Moses is telling them. See what the salvation the Lord's about to bring to you. Look at what God's about to do. Make sure you put this in the God did this category. Because it's easy to just feel like life just kind of happens and things kind of go our way sometimes. So what's about to happen is so powerful that within 24 hours, this mighty Egyptian army is going to be scared out of their wits. Okay, they're going to be totally terrified. And Moses says, you're never going to see them again. Ever. You will never happen with this army again. So he tells them three things. Have courage. Have courage. Or do not fear, right? Have courage. Stand firm. See what God's about to do. Keep your eyes out and realize God's about to work. The other thing we see is that Moses has faith and then God shows up. And God does all the fighting. God takes care of the issue. Let's look at verse 19. The angel of God, who had been going before the camp of Israel, okay, so he had been leading them by the cloud, by the fire, moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them. Verse 20. So it came between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel. And there was a cloud along with the darkness. And so it caused darkness for the Egyptians, but it gave light at night. This one did not come, and thus one did not come near the other all night. So so God moves, and he becomes a barrier, a physical barrier, bringing darkness for Egypt, bringing light for the Israelites. If I was the Egyptians, I'd be a little nervous when God brings darkness when there shouldn't be darkness, because last time that happened, the next thing that happened is a whole bunch of people died. The 9th plague was darkness. The 10th plague was the killing of the firstborn. But God is between them, protecting them. Verse 21, and Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord swept the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and turned the sea into dry land, so the waters were divided. The sons of Israel went through the midst of the sea on dry land, and the waters were like a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. So God used this natural force. It says he brought in this east wind and divided the water.
Why east wind? Why not a west wind?
It was the east wind because it came from the east.
And also California's from the west, so don't just
So this wind came in and divided the water. How many of you have seen that happen? The wind kicks up on the lake and the water just. I've driven over the bay dozens of times, and I've driven over the bay when it's like a wicked storm. It's like, I don't know if I want to be on this bridge right now. And you drive across the bay, and this wicked storm's going on, wind going everywhere, and I've never seen any dry land. I've seen some big waves. I never see any dry land at the bottom of it. People try to give a natural explanation for a spiritual miracle that God does. And someone said, well, there was like this hurricane, tornado, force wind. I've seen videos of hurricanes and tornadoes over water too. There's no dry land. And let's say it worked. Let's say God camped a tornado. The east wind was this tornado that was over the Red Sea and parted the waters and dried it out real quick and everything. How in the world are 2 million Israelites going to walk through a tornado?
Aliens.
I don't know. So the other explanation, yes, it was a wind. It did part the waters, and they walked through, and it was dry, but it was a marshy area, and the water was only about 6 or 8 inches deep, and so it was pretty cool, but not that cool.
It's called a sea for a reason.
Well, the amazing thing is, if it was 6 or 8 inches deep, how cool is God that he could drown the whole Egyptian army in 6 or 8 inches of water?
Those are mad chariots.
Yeah, and their chariots and their horses. That's pretty powerful, right? You can't put a natural spin on this. This is God's hand at work. God is fighting this fight, and there's no doubt about them. No doubt about it. And he's put the pillar between them, giving light to Israel and darkness to the Egyptians. Now, that at night, that wind is kicked up, dried, it put the water into 2 walls on either side. Some speculate that path may have been about a half mile wide or something like that, because they're just doing logistics of how big would it have to be to get 2 million people across within the time frame noted. So some people have come up with that kind of thing. So if you're trying to picture it in your mind, it wasn't this little narrow path that you could be like going down both sides with fingers in the water kind of thing. It was a big open area, and it went from sea to dry land like that. God is fighting this fight, and so they're backed into a corner, but the corner just opened up. They have no way out until there's a way out. God can work in our lives in some crazy ways. And those times that you think there is no way out, there's no option for me, don't ever undersell God. Don't ever think God can't work in this situation. That's what the Israelites were thinking, weren't they? Moses, what are you thinking? Why did you bring us here to die? Because there's no way out. There's no options. So they're through the night, they're all crossing the Red Sea and walking to the other side where it's dry ground, even after the sea will be back in place. Verse 23. The Egyptians took up the pursuit, and all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen went in after them into the midst of the sea. And at the morning watch, the Lord looked down on the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud, and brought the army of the Egyptians to confusion. He caused their chariot wheels to swerve, and he made them drive with difficulty. So the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from Israel, for the Lord is fighting for them." against the Egyptians. They finally figured that out. A couple months late. I wonder what was going on in their minds. They just went into the sea.
A lot of our potential army has already been taken out by the 10th plague.
But the water is pulled back. They went into the sea. That looks normal. Let's go. I don't, it's like, did they understand what was going on? Did they get what was happening? It was nighttime, so maybe they didn't realize because it's a wide opening. Maybe they thought they were somewhere different. I don't know. But then it tells us at the time of the morning watch, that's when the sun comes up. Oh no! This is before that. So between 2 and 6 a.m. That's when they start to head in. Is the morning watch. So somewhere between 2 and 6 a.m. they start to head into the water, into the Red Sea on the dry ground. Then God causes. Okay, God's totally fighting this fight. He causes confusion. Can God bring about confusion to accomplish His purposes? Absolutely. He did that at the Tower of Babel, right? He does that here. He did that in several battles in the Old Testament. The enemy would start killing each other because God brought confusion into their midst, and so He brings confusion. He brings malfunction to their chariots. Wheels start falling off. Things stop working, and then the realization that God is fighting for Israel. And God is fighting against us. This is not a good situation, guys. So jump down to verse 26. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the waters may come back over the Egyptians, over their chariots and over their horsemen." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal state at daybreak, while the Egyptians were fleeing right into it. Then the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. Waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen, even Pharaoh's entire army that had gone into the sea after them. Not even one of them remained. So when did this happen? At daybreak. Right as the sun's coming up. Right as it's starting to get light enough for them to look around and realize, oh crap, we're trying our water. This is not a good situation. Chariots aren't working. They're way over there. We're surrounded by water.
Uh-oh.
They were crushed by the walls. They were crushed by the walls of water coming down on them. They were crushed and drowned, and not one of them remained.
It's a pretty horrific way to die, right?
Yeah.
Just like being crushed by if you're in a trench or whatnot.
And so it was a very decisive victory and a very 100% victory with no casualties on Israel's part because God was fighting battle. And not one of Pharaoh's men, not one of his horses, not one of his chariots was alive.
The most pitiful part about this entire thing is that the captain didn't go down with a ship, because if you might notice, it says Pharaoh's entire army, but Pharaoh himself is not mentioned.
He's not mentioned. I believe he wasn't part of that.
Yeah.
So
captain goes down with a ship, but he was too cowardly. So
God told them through Moses. God told them three things: take courage, stand, see what God's going to do, because God knew what was about to happen. God knew what was about to happen. He knew what he was going to do, and he was calling on them to trust him. We're not quite there yet, but this event is so impactful and so powerful that 40 years later, as they're entering the promised land, as the spies are in the city of Jericho, the pagan people in another land, hundreds and hundreds of miles away, feared the Israelites and feared their God because they knew of this event. Listen to Joshua. Let me read a couple verses in Joshua chapter 2. In verse 8 it says, "Now before they lay down," so I'm in Joshua 2:8. Before they lay down, the spies were at Rahab's house. She came up to them on the roof and said to the men, here's what this woman who's grown up in a pagan culture, who's lived an immoral life, here's her understanding of Israel's relationship to God. "I know that the Lord has given you land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land have melted away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites, who were beyond the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. When we heard it, our hearts melted, and no courage remained in any man any longer because of you, for the Lord your God, He is God in heaven. He is God in heaven above and on earth beneath." That's Rahab's testimony 40 years later of this event and the impact. Her perspective on the power of God. From the day God first promised that He would give them a land, this day was a sure thing. It was set in stone and there was no going back. Before he died, Joseph gave instructions. So Joseph is Abraham's great-grandson, right?
Yes.
Yes. And because of him, because of his role in Egypt, the whole Israel, all the descendants of Abraham, of Jacob, essentially, ended up in Israel. And before Joseph died, he gave instructions. He said, in Genesis chapter 50, he said, "Take my bones and bury them back in the land God has given us." As you read through chapter 13, you read, Moses brought the bones of Joseph with him. Joseph had 100% confidence that God was going to deliver them just as He promised. He had that confidence 400 years before it happened. God's never failed to keep a single promise. And we can have that same confidence that Moses had, that Joseph had. So, as you saw tonight, a couple things for this week. That the message from Moses is just such a challenge. Do not fear. Stand firm. See what God does. Take courage. Don't back down. Watch how God works in the situation. Ask God. Take these 3 things. Ask God how you need to trust Him. That situation. For some of you, there's a big thing weighing on you in your life. Does this fit? For some of you, there's a little thing. It's a little thing at this point. But it doesn't mean God doesn't want the situation. How does God want to work through these truths, these challenges to us? Not through it. We'll see. Let's pray. God, I thank you that you've shown us examples of your people. Shown us how you deliver possible circumstances. God, sometimes we just like go back in the corner and start. We take our eyes off the circumstances, get over it, see no way to help. God, I pray for stand.